1946, in the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv, a composer premiered his first symphony. It was a symphony of grief, of remembrance, of defiance. This was Dmitri Klebanov's Symphony No. 1, dedicated to the martyrs of Babi Yar, the 34,000 Jews massacred by Nazi soldiers in a ravine in Kyiv. The symphony's first performances were received with rapturous applause. It should have made Klebanov a cultural hero in his country and in the greater Soviet Union. Instead, it brought him only condemnation and fear, and his symphony would not be heard again in his lifetime. I'm Nicholas Hersh. I'm a conductor and arranger, and I serve as music director of the Modesto Symphony Orchestra in California. My colleagues at the MSO and I will have the great privilege of presenting the American premiere of Klebanov's ill-fated First Symphony this November 2025, which also marks the first time the symphony will be heard outside of Ukraine. I'll be sharing a short series of videos like this one to introduce this Ukrainian composer who, at least in this conductor's opinion, ought to regain his place in music history. Dmytro Lvovich Klebanov was born in 1907 to a working-class Jewish family in Kharkiv. A child prodigy, he entered the local conservatory at 16 years old, the youngest in his class. After graduating in 1926, Dmitri, now going by the Russified version of his name to be better accepted in Soviet professional circles, joined the Leningrad Opera Orchestra as a violist, where he worked with giants of the musical world, such as conductors Otto Klemperer and Bruno Walter, and composers Alban Berg and a fellow young Dmitri Shostakovich. Returning to Ukraine in the 1930s, Klebanov eventually joined the faculty of his alma mater, Kharkiv Conservatory. Klebanov's composition career really began to catch fire with the success of his ballet The Little Stork, as well as his 1940 violin concerto. And in that same year, he married Nina Dyakovskaya, the conservatory's director. Klebanov's burgeoning reputation in this period of history really speaks to his tenacity and his talent, as he and his fellow Ukrainian creatives faced brutal repression during these years. Stalin's government had a policy of suppressing the cultural identities and ideologies of the various Soviet nations in an effort to create a single Soviet people. In Ukraine, this manifested as the systemic abduction, imprisonment, and execution of a generation of writers, artists, and thinkers in the 1930s, a period that came to be known as the Executed Renaissance. In June 1941, Hitler broke his non-aggression pact with Stalin, starting with the invasion of Kyiv. Klebanov and his family were among 150,000 Jews evacuated to Uzbekistan. Interestingly, these 2 years in exile represented a creative evolution for Klebanov. He mingled and exchanged ideas with fellow artists from all across the Soviet Union who had also fled Nazi incursions, and he joined the rapidly growing movie industry in Tashkent, composing scores for anti-Nazi propaganda films. The Klebanovs returned first to Kyiv after its liberation in 1943, and then home to Kharkiv 2 years later. Klebanov's hometown was absolutely devastated by the war. Some 70% of the city was destroyed. But according to his granddaughter Nina, the most personal toll for Klebanov was the death of his brother, a soldier in the Soviet army. And this would be the true impetus for his very first symphony, subtitled Memory of the Martyrs of Babi Yar. Now, I'm sure some of your ears are already ringing when I mention Babi Yar in the context of a symphony, and indeed, Dmitri Shostakovich's 13th symphony shares this dedication. Taking the form of a kind of symphony/oratorio for men's chorus and orchestra, it is set to poems by Yevgeny Yevtushenko. However, Shostakovich's 13th was written some 20 years after Klebanov's first. And Klebanov's Babi Yar is a raw and emotional response to an inhuman atrocity from an authentic Ukrainian Jewish perspective. And it is perhaps this rawness which became its eventual curse. Babi Yar, or Babin Yar in Ukrainian, is a ravine within the city limits of Kyiv. It earned its infamy in September 1941. Soviet spies had planted explosives that damaged the infrastructure of the occupying Nazi army in Kyiv, and in retaliation, the Nazi commander ordered the mass execution of the entire remaining Jewish population of Kyiv, numbering then at 33,771. Serving both as a tribute to fallen countrymen as well as a brutal indictment of Nazism, Klebanov's First is the very model of the Soviet realist symphony. A dark and brooding first movement, a raucous scherzo, and an elegiac third movement build up to a tumultuous and then finally triumphant finale, as if to say to the erstwhile Nazi occupiers, "You shall not defeat us." And in that finale, in a moment of respite amongst all the tumult, we have this musical moment. The call of a shofar, the traditional Hebrew ram's horn, is played in the symphony orchestra by the English horn. The symphony premiered in Kharkiv in 1946 as part of an all-Klebanov program and received glowing reviews. The mournful focus and the outpouring of emotional colors naturally come from the tragic concept of the symphony. The eternal philosophical theme of life and death is explored through the prism of the composer's own perception of historical events. Several more performances immediately followed in Kharkiv and then Kyiv. Then word of the symphony reached Moscow. When it was submitted for the 1949 Stalin Prize, Soviet authorities reacted not with praise, but swift condemnation. Apparently, this minor reference to the shofar, as well as some of the symphony's melodic content, was enough for Stalin's censors to declare that the whole thing was dedicated specifically to Jewish and not Soviet martyrs. This pronouncement filtered down through all the usual cultural channels. For instance, at an official meeting of Ukrainian composers, a colleague of Klebanov who had once praised his work now panned the whole enterprise. Klebanov, he said, wrote a symphony permeated by the spirit of bourgeois nationalism and ruthless cosmopolitanism, basing it on old Jewish religious songs, the rituals of ancient Palestine, the lamentation of Israel's synagogue tunes. Such are the sources which inspired Klebanov in the creation of this anti-patriotic symphony. These terms, bourgeois nationalist and rootless cosmopolitan, are essentially Soviet dog whistles. It meant that you put national identity before Soviet identity and promoted decadent foreign influence. And the latter, rootless cosmopolitan, had an especially long history as a catch-all term for anything remotely related to Jewish identity. To be called either was more often than not a death sentence during the Stalin regime. Further performances of Klebanov's First Symphony were banned. Klebanov was stripped of titles and publicly shamed. Only through his wife's connections as a government bureaucrat was he able to keep a teaching position in Kharkiv, which he very likely also saved him from a much worse fate. He was not imprisoned. He was simply and thoroughly silenced, erased. In his forced isolation, Klebanov continued to teach and compose, though his work was rarely heard outside of Kharkiv. He wrote 8 more symphonies and an extensive catalog of works for orchestra, ensemble, and the stage, some of which towed the Soviet party line, but others quietly pushing musical experimental boundaries. He never heard his First Symphony again. He requested that it be performed only after his death, which occurred in 1987. Recording with the Ukrainian State Symphony, which you've been hearing in this video, was made just before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And as you can hear, it is unfortunately a bit muddy and inconsistent. For now, though, it's all we have. For decades, Dmitri Klebanov was unknown outside of Ukraine, a mere footnote in Soviet-era music history. But in recent years, his remarkable music has gladly seen a revival. I first discovered Klebanov thanks to this recording by the Arc Ensemble at the Royal Conservatory in Canada, which features some of his most affecting chamber music, like this string quartet, featuring a set of variations on the Ukrainian tune Shchedrik, better known in the West as the Carol of the Bells. I reached out to Arc's director, Simon Winberg, who not only graciously helped me understand the historical context around this composer, but also put me in touch with a colleague named Stefan Hlushko, who was able to send me a copy of the manuscript for Klebanov's First Symphony, perhaps the only surviving manuscript, as the majority of the materials related to the symphony were likely lost in a fire. Meanwhile, the Kharkiv Conservatory, where Klebanov worked and which houses much of his work, has suffered severe damage in the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Based on the manuscript, I was able to transcribe, edit, and completely recreate the orchestral parts for modern performance. And as I worked, I became more and more enthralled with Klebanov's voice as a symphonist. He's able to weave a tight web of interconnected themes throughout all 4 movements, all while gently pushing conventional harmony and orchestration into new and exciting territory. It's a symphony and a composer who have deserved better. We hope to shed just that little bit more light on Klebanov's story now, as we lead up to our premiere performances with the Modesto Symphony Orchestra on November 14 and 15, 2025. And stay tuned for the next video in the series, where we'll dive into the music of Klebanov's First Symphony. So until then, thanks for watching.